Ann Todgham, our speaker for the day. She's an environmental physiologist with an interest in understanding the molecular, biochemical, and physiological mechanisms that underlie an animal's capacity to cope with environmental change. Anne is fascinated by the diversity of physiological specializations, or we might call them strategies, used by animals to tolerate particular habitats that other animals would find very challenging. This interest has led her research to investigate how an animal's physiology and environment interact to structure organismal stress tolerance. Anne's current research program has an eye towards global climate change and addresses the general questions of whether contemporary animals have the physiological flexibility necessary to buffer the unprecedented rates of environmental change, specifically their responses to changes in multiple environmental variables occurring simultaneously, such as currently the case. Her research focuses mainly on aquatic organisms that are distributed among the California coast and estuaries. Organisms such as limpets, sea urchins, crabs, oysters, and intertidal fishes. But her research also extends to Antarctic fishes and aquaculture species.
I am absolutely thrilled to be here. So one thing that my academic profile at UC Davis doesn't share with all of you is that I am a long-term camper at Glen Bernard Camp. And so it is really a pleasure to be invited back to the Near North Enviro-Education Center to talk a little bit about what's happened since I was a camper and a staff member at camp. And so, yes, I'm currently in California, but I have a real home in Ontario as well as in Northern Ontario. So I want to start with a land acknowledgement. And so this is the land acknowledgement for Davis, California. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Kachil-Dehe Band of Wuntun Indians of the Calusa Indian community, the Quechol-Dehe-Wuntun Nation, and the Yocha-Dehe-Wuntun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. And so I just encourage all of you, if you haven't actually looked at your land acknowledgement for wherever you are, I suggest taking a moment after this lecture and looking at whose land we are graciously able to work on these days. So I'll start with, I'll start here. So this is me. I'm guessing around 8 or 9, which is about the time that I went to Glen Bernard Camp. And at that time, I was just fascinated with the natural world. And I think camp, one thing that camp has done for many of us, has sort of instilled sort of that natural historian in all of us and really allowed us to flourish. And so this is a photo of me. I used to go when I was with my family in Nova Scotia, as well in Maine, and play around in the rocky tide pools. And I was always really interested in finding as many critters as I could find. And really what I was asking at an early age, although probably I couldn't articulate it then, was how can an environment that is so harsh support such a diverse group of animals? So now I've gone to quite a bit of school. I went to school probably for far too long, if you ask my parents. But I'm still fascinated by biodiversity, and I'm particularly interested in being part of the solution for how do we protect that biodiversity in the face of change, right? So animals, despite having really very similar genes, we find very different animals in really diverse habitats around the globe, right? So if you think about when you go on vacation, what you see, let's say if you're snorkeling or you're walking around a forest, is very different than what you would see out your back door right now, right? And that just doesn't have to do with season. And part of the reason we find such biodiversity is that an animal's environment has a very important role in structuring its physiology. So as David said, I'm an environmental physiologist. So basically I'm an animal physiologist, and I use physiology to understand how an animal's environment shapes its ecology. So I probe at different levels underneath the skin of an animal to understand how is it integrating this environmental signal, and how does this affect their performance. There are things like growth, metabolism, which is basically the cost of living, stress tolerance, and behavior, and how changes in an animal's environment might ultimately affect these different processes at the more ecological scales, like the distribution and abundance of animals, how different communities might be structured depending on the environment in which they live, and so on. So what I want to do today is kind of split the talk into three parts. I want to talk a little bit about climate change. So what changes are we expecting? And I know that many of us have a good sense of what's going on and what's being projected, but it's always good to kind of remind ourselves of all the changes that will be happening. I then want to talk a little bit about what animals have to work with. And then I'm going to give a little case study of some of the work that I do down in the Antarctic to look at how vulnerable they are to future ocean conditions. Because while this is going to be a little doom and gloom while we talk about climate change, the possibilities are endless for people who want to get involved in science and the type of science that looks at sort of how animals are going to fare in the face of climate change. So let's start with climate change. What changes are we expecting? Okay, so as many of you know, carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere are rising. And what I'm showing you here on this graph is where CO2 levels have been over the last almost 1 million years, right? So this is actually data that's collected from an ice core in the Antarctic, where there are little gas bubbles throughout the ice core, and they can measure how much CO2 at different times through history. And you can see that for millennia, atmospheric CO2 never really got above 300 microatmospheres or parts per million. Right now, we're at about 412 parts per thousand. So you can see, sorry, parts per million. So you can see that we are above anything that's been experienced in the last 800,000 years on this graph. And I can tell you it's actually closer to anything high. We haven't seen anything like this in the last 10 million years. And so these changes in CO2 are having profound effects on lots of different processes, physical processes on the planet, right? So, we're seeing this increase in greenhouse gases, which are primarily CO2, but there's also things like methane. We're seeing increases in temperature, right? We used to call climate change global warming because we really had only appreciated the fact that these increases in CO2 were leading to warming, and we really didn't have a good appreciation for all the other things that it was doing as well. So with these increases in temperature, we're seeing changes in where species are found, right? Things are moving poleward. Animals at their southern range limits are decreasing in abundance. We're seeing timing of seasonal cycles changing as it's getting warmer sooner. And we're seeing things like the loss of Arctic and Antarctic ice. We're getting increases in sea level, and many communities around the world, actually, that is probably one of the most alarming issues that they're dealing with right now, because as the glaciers melt, as water gets to, the volume of our oceans are getting bigger because it's warmer, there are many communities that where sea level rise is going to be a major problem. We're seeing an increase in extreme weather events. So this was accentuated this year with the number of hurricanes we had in the Gulf. There's changes in precipitation patterns. And then some of the things you might be less familiar with are ocean acidification, which is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, as well as dead zones or areas of the ocean, as well as freshwater lakes that are becoming very low in oxygen or hypoxic. So how do we know what's happening? So there is an international organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, that was set up jointly by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations to really provide an authoritative statement on our scientific understanding of climate change. And I'm showing you 2007. Actually, I should have updated this. We now, the most recent ones have been coming out in the last couple of years, and there was one in between these. And we really use this as a standard reference for understanding what are the projections, like what do we expect to happen? And most of those projections are for what do we expect to see by the year 2100. And what we know based on those projections, if you remember, I've shown you this slide, our current level is at about 412. We anticipate that we will be by the year 2100 at 1200 microatmospheres of carbon dioxide. So yes, I know it's off the slide. And I know the steepness of this graph now is really alarming. And so that's why there's really been a call to action of organismal biologists, whether you're an evolutionary biologist or you're an ecologist or you're a social scientist, to really understand what are the sensitivities of our contemporary plants and animals and microbes on this planet to these projected changes, because it's happening so quickly. So these IPCC scenarios, they provide these projections of the future, right? So they say that if everyone stopped emitting all CO2 and we all rode bikes and no more travel, I mean, pretty much like what it's like in the pandemic, that we would level off at this relative concentration, and we wouldn't see as much increase in temperature wouldn't see that much, but if we continued as normal, this is sort of our worst case scenario, the 8.5 scenario. And so this is looking at temperature change, sea level rise, so all those things plus a lot more factors are going to be sort of have projections that we can look to. So we are in a committed period of global warming. And what that means is, and you'll see this on the next slide, that even if we stopped emitting CO2 now, about 50% of the warming that we're going to have in the next 20 years is already committed to the CO2 we have in the atmosphere. And that's because it takes a long time for CO2 to be absorbed by the ocean and cycled through the ocean and kind of removed from our atmosphere and removed from its warming effect. So to date, the ocean has absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat in our climate system. And if we surpass a +2 degree increase in temperature, the ocean is going to absorb about 5 to 7 times more heat by the year 2100. So, right, so ocean warming is projected to change by about +2 to +6 degrees Celsius. It doesn't seem like a lot, but you have to remember that in the ocean, the majority of the animals that live there, their body temperature is the same temperature as the ocean. They're ectotherms. So that actually represents quite a bit of a change for them internally. And we've already started to see these shifts in where animals live, both in the water, but also on land. So over the last century, temperature in general has increased by 3/4 degree Celsius. Actually, since 1950s, it's increased 1 degree in the Antarctic, which is one of the reasons that I work down there. It's projected to increase by 1 to 3.7 degrees Celsius. And if you take the error terms, that's how you sort of get the 2 to 6 degrees that I told you on the last slide. The warming rate this century is 5 times the rate that's been documented in the past. And we have much faster warming over land than the ocean, and we're seeing a much increased incidence of heat waves. The other CO2 problem is ocean acidification. So what I'm showing you here, this is the Mauna Loa record. So this is levels of CO2 that are measured in Hawaii. And you can see that through time, they go up and down, right? Up in the summer when there's all kinds of productivity with plants and things producing CO2, and down in the winter. And so you can see this, right? So this is kind of natural fluctuations. And then what we're getting on top of that is this climate change signal, which is increasing over time. And as CO2 levels in the atmosphere increase, CO2 levels in the ocean are also increasing. And what this is doing as the CO2 is dissolving in the ocean is that it's causing a decrease in the pH, or it's a decrease in the pH or an increase in the acidity. Now, I just want to say, you know, many of you are in Ontario, and so when I grew up, acid rain was a problem. This is different than acid rain, but the effects that we're seeing on animals are very similar to what we saw with acid rain. It's just a different way of acidifying the aquatic environment. And lakes are not as susceptible to increases in CO2 as they were to acid rain. So the ocean is a sink for atmospheric CO2, right? So it absorbs it. And for the longest time, you know, climate scientists would say, don't worry, I mean, climate change is going to be bad, but the ocean is going to take the grunt of it, and we're going to be okay. What we're realizing is that as CO2 dissolves in the ocean, it is causing, right, a decrease in pH or an increase in acidity. And acidity has increased about 30 times in the last about 150 years. The other big problem is that we're having a decrease in carbonate. And calcium carbonate is what makes up the shells of a lot of the things that live in oceans. Things like corals, right? The structure of a coral reef, that's made out of aragonite, calcium carbonate. The shells of clams and oysters and mussels and sea urchins. And so what's happening is we're having almost like things are sort of becoming somewhat like osteoporosis, right? They're losing the calcium carbonate they need to keep their not their bones in this case, but their shells or their internal skeletons nice and strong. And so what this has meant for us on the Pacific coast is that we've seen big losses in oysters and mussels and scallops because of this increase in corrosive seawater that washes up on our shores here on the west coast of the United States, as well as the west coast of Canada. So there have also been similar losses in British Columbia with their oyster hatcheries. And so we've seen basically an 80% reduction in oyster seed output. And so a lot of changes had been made since we started to see these changes. And some of it has meant that people have moved their seed productions over to Hawaii, where there's less of this corrosive nearshore water. The last one I want to talk about is ocean deoxygenation. And this is just the loss of oxygen from the ocean, as this is very similar to what you would see in lakes. So the Great Lakes are experiencing aquatic deoxygenation as well. And that's first because warmer water holds less oxygen. Second, there's less mixing of the top layer, which is where all the plants are producing CO2. But they're producing oxygen. It's no longer mixing, getting down low. And so we have this lower level that's more and more hypoxic or low in oxygen. And what's really we're seeing a lot of is eutrophication, which is just basically fertilizers and other nutrients are coming off the land from things like agriculture or sewage treatment plants. And it's causing this big boom of algae, which is basically eating down the oxygen that's there, meaning that there's less oxygen for the other things that live in the ocean. And so we've seen a lot of this in the Gulf of Mexico. But you've seen some of this in the Bay of Fundy and some of this also happening in the St. Lawrence, where you see these huge shoals of dead fish that wash up, not due to red tide, but also due to there not being enough oxygen in the water for them to survive. So basically, global climate change is having profound effects worldwide. And so I was telling you a little bit about the physical systems, which are in this turquoise blue color, and some of the biological systems that are being affected. I was telling you about what's happening mostly in the marine environment, but there are similar problems happening in forests and with wildfires particularly. This is another big problem that we're having in California. But I also just want to draw your attention to that there are a number of human or managed systems that are also feeling the effects of climate change. And a lot of this has to do with food production, particularly during these extended droughts that we're now having in our summer months, where land that was really good for growing food before is no longer suitable. And we're also seeing effects on livelihood, health, and economics. Okay, so I'm going to do a switch and tell you a little bit about what animals have to work with. So when we think about climate change, we think about three different problems that animals are faced with. The first is that this is an environment that the animals that live on this planet today and their ancestors that go back many, many generations have never seen, right? So they're not prepared for the environment that they're living in now, and they're not prepared for the environment in which they are projected to be in the next couple decades to a century. The rate of environmental change is faster than anything that their ancestors have seen for the last 10 million years. And what I'm really particularly interested in is that many factors are changing together. And so if we want to understand how animals are faring, we need to know how good they are at multitasking. And so our real question is, can biology keep up with environmental change? So organisms in general, this is the same for plants and for animals, they have three response options when they're faced with environmental change. Well, they have three that are useful, right? They can actually, one of the other responses is they do nothing and they die. And we've seen a lot of animals that have gone extinct over the last little while because of impacts, human-induced impacts in our environment. But let's talk about what are, I want this to be a bit more hopeful, so let's talk about what are the options that animals have and plants. So they can disperse to more hospitable habitats, right? So they can move or migrate and try to follow the environment that more resembles what they're used to, right? So that's why we have this poleward tracking of both plants and animals northward. And I'm sure in Canada, like I have seen here in California, there are many different species that you didn't see when you were growing up that you now see routinely during the summer, during the winter. This is particularly evident for us along our coasts in California, where there are things that used to never make it past kind of southern Mexico that we're now seeing kind of in northern California. Species can adapt through genetic change, through the process of evolution, and species can flex the physiology that they have on board right now to be able to tolerate new conditions. So let me explain to you how I think about this, because I focus mainly on this third one in my research group. Okay, so what I have here is sea surface temperature, but this could also be the air temperature as well, right? So it's sort of, it comes up in the summer, down in the winter, and through time, it's going to start to feel the effect of climate change, and this cycle is going to go up. This is an animal that has a single threshold, right? So this is how much warming it can tolerate. So the animal's going to be fine here. It's going to start to be stressed here. And unless it does something, you aren't going to find it in that environment anymore once we get to this far end. Now, of course, within a community of animals, right? So think about that picture I showed you of a tide pool. There were anemones in there, there were crabs, there were fish, right? The different animals that are in there are going to have different thresholds, right? So there's the animal that's represented by the black line. Then we have an animal represented by the yellow line, and another animal that's represented by the blue line. And of course, the animals that are represented by the blue line will be able to sustain kind of a normal life for much longer, and will be able to absorb much more warming than the other animals that are depicted on this graph. Why there is hope, and so why I do what I do, and why I continue to have students come join me and do what we do, is that animals can bend this tolerance curve. So this is a term called acclimatization. It can also happen through adaptation, but right now we're dealing with really changes over very short time periods. So most animals have to be able to almost retailor their physiology to their new environment. They can bend this curve. And this is this flexibility that I'm really interested in understanding. So my research lab, on a really basic level, what we ask is, how much can an animal's tolerance bend, and what allows it to do that? Are there common mechanisms that allow some animals to bend more than others? And the reason we ask these questions is we don't have time to study everything. So if we can find some unifying themes, then we can make pretty accurate projections on how different communities will function by knowing that, you know, animals within these groups tend to be able to respond because of X. So it gives us some ability to project or predict. And then what I really want to know is, what are the animal's limits? So where does that change in environment end up butting up against their tolerance line? And will it reach them within the next few decades? Because that's where we need to be focusing our efforts on trying to manage stressors that we have the ability to manage on a more of a short-term time scale. So things like fishing, we can set up marine reserves, which are a lot like national parks, but in the water, so that we can try to reduce the kind of stressors that we can control, so that animals can put their energy towards those stressors that are going to take a little longer for us to get under control. Right, so as I said, we should expect many things to change at once. So I was just showing you how things, an animal's tolerance to a single stressor, temperature change, but really animals have to deal with a lot of changes all at once. And so in my lab, we ask questions that are centered around, are aquatic animals good at multitasking? And I look at things from different species of fish. Some of them are in aquaculture, like sturgeon that produce caviar in California, or mussels and oysters that are important for our shellfish industry. I also look at fishes that control our water use in California, which are these different smelt species. And as well as, this is, you can't tell, but these are baby Chinook salmon with their yolk sacs. What I want to talk about today, though, is some of the work that I've done in the Antarctic, because there is a wow factor to working in the Antarctic. And I want to encourage, especially if there are any students on this that are interested in science, to know that there is a lot of room in this research community now for you to join in and bring your new ideas and perspectives and how we can come up with solutions for climate change. Okay, so let's look at some of the Antarctic work that I do as sort of my wrap up. And down there, I'm particularly interested in studying how ocean warming and ocean acidification are going to affect early life stages of fishes. So I work on fish that are about 1 year to 2 years old. So this is this emerald rock cod. This is what its parent would look like, but this is what it looks like, right? It looks like just a little kind of darter that you might find in a stream. I don't know if we have any fish in the Coke stream anymore at GBC, but this would be kind of a fish that you might expect to see in the streams kind of around Sunridge. Although of course this is a saltwater fish, but they look a lot like freshwater darters. I also look at fish eggs, so really early life stages, because they are some of the most sensitive to change. So why do I spend so much time down in the Antarctic? And that's because polar regions are predicted to be the most vulnerable to climate change. So they're experiencing some of the fastest rates of change than anywhere else in the world. Organisms that live there are very sensitive to change because they've evolved under stable conditions for millions of years. So like the fishes, they have seen sub-zero conditions for 11 to 14 million years, right? That's a long time. It's actually hard to think about how long that is. And temperatures are projected to change about 2 to 4 degrees in the next 80 years. So that's a big change for them. I also work down there because many of these animals are found nowhere else. So these are animals that can take advantage of that first strategy and move somewhere that's colder. This is as cold as you can get, and there isn't any more ocean from where I am. You basically hit the continent of Antarctica, and so they can't migrate. So they're stuck there, and they have to do something. And so, and I guess one other reason which I didn't put on here is what's happening in the Antarctic is a result of what the rest of us are doing throughout the world, because our atmospheres over the different continents are all tightly linked by airflow and circulation patterns. So the CO2 that we're emitting throughout North America and Europe, it is making its way down to the Antarctic as well as the Arctic, and is contributing to climate change in a place that has contributed very little CO2 on its own to the atmosphere. And lastly, the reason I do what I do where I do it is that we have an incredible facility down in the Antarctic as part of the US Antarctic program. This is called McMurdo Station. It's the largest research station down in the Antarctic. It's one of 3 US stations. And if you want to work in the Antarctic, the only way you can do it is to be funded by the National Science Foundation and to be able to be supported to work at these facilities. It really behaves like a small town. There's upwards of about 1,000 people in the summer. This year there's only 300 because of COVID, and there's no COVID on the continent. So there's no research really much going on this year to try to keep COVID out of the Antarctic. But you know, this is it's a pretty state-of-the-art research lab, and this bottom floor is where we get to do all the aquarium work. It's very easy to find food, especially in a snowstorm. It's the big blue building. And then we live in these big dorms that are a lot like university dorms. I'm also lucky because I get to be joined by a lot of students, both undergraduate students. Oh, I forgot to put their names. So this is Melitz Mandich, also a Canadian. She's a postdoctoral scholar, and Mandy Fraser, who's a PhD student in the lab. These are my different field teams from the different times I've been down there. I've been really privileged to go to the Antarctic 5 times and 4 times leading my own research expeditions. This last year, I got to bring an elementary school teacher with me, which was really phenomenal because we were able to really communicate the science we were doing really more broadly and get it into the classrooms through outreach activities that we did. And Denise is continuing to bring our research into the classroom through different learning activities and seminars that she's giving. We also have a fair amount of fun. So this is a picture of Andrew and Ken, who very, very quickly changed into summer clothing and went out to the glacier and got a photo of them out there. But it was very, very quick. I can tell you they ran back into our hut very quickly to change back into their extreme weather gear. So how do we assess vulnerability to stress? So as I mentioned, what I like to do is I look at what is an animal's stress tolerance now, and how does that reflect its ability to sort of cope with the changes that are projected, right? So if it lives well within its stress tolerance now, right, it has these big safety margins, then that animal is more likely to be able to cope with projected change. But I'm really interested in what animals do at the sort of sublethal level, right? Animals have to do more than just survive. They have to grow, they have to develop, they have to reproduce, right? Animals' #1 goal is to pass their genes on to the next generation. So I focus on how animals balance energy supply and demand, and whether or not there are trade-offs in where energy is allocated to be able to cope with the stress of climate change. And so this is how I think about it. In this case, we have, right, a pie. The majority of an animal's energy budget goes to just keeping the lights on. And then depending on, you know, different times of years, it's giving energy to growing, to moving around, right, foraging for food or running away from predators, reproduction, and then stress response. And under stress, the amount of energy that goes to basal maintenance, so keeping the lights on, as well as stress increases, and that pinches how much energy is available for all these other things that we kind of put with an animal's fitness, which is its ability to really pass its genes on to the next generation. And even in some cases, the size of the pie shrinks because less energy is available. So that even decreases the amount of energy to these important biological processes even more. So what we do is we use those IPCC scenarios to give us projections of where the oceans are going to be for the year 2100. And we either bubble that CO2, that level of CO2 gas into our fish tanks, and we change the temperature of the water around those tanks to really simulate future ocean conditions. And we put the animals in for long periods of time, and we ask them all along from a physiological perspective, how are you doing? Where is the energy going? So because I'm one of the privileged few that gets to work down in the Antarctic. I thought I would give you a few sort of photos of what this looks like. So this is our field office, right? So we work on top of the sea ice. So the sea ice is anywhere from sort of 6 to 9 feet thick. So going fishing is a little bit more arduous than, you know, you all going to the lake right now and throwing in a rod and reel. We have a big machine that digs a big hole through the ice and then pulls this nice heated hut on top of it. We drive around on the sea ice in these things called piston bullies and notice these really long tracks. So this allows us to go over cracks in the ice without worrying of falling in. So we can go over cracks that are about 1 foot to 2 feet wide. It seems like a lot, but this base that we have allows us to do that really safely. It's also a really warm environment if we get stuck out on the ice and we have to wait out a storm because we can't see. This is a beautiful day, but I could have a similar picture in a whiteout condition and you wouldn't be able to see anything. And those are the days where we have to stop where we are, wait for the weather to clear, and then come home. Because we need fish, it means we need divers. And so the divers want these nice heated huts so they can get ready and dive in through this hole. And I'll just note, this is my PhD student, Mandy Fraser, right here. So it's not just hired divers from the program. So Rob and Steve have been diving for over 68 years together. So Rob is the longest person in the Antarctic at the moment. And this is another team right here. And once you get under the ice, there's ice everywhere, right? So these sort of this ice that's coming down from the surface and this ice that's coming up from the bottom that we call anchor ice. And the fish love hiding in all of this. So once you get down there, it's time to start searching for the fish. And so dragonfish eggs are very easy to find because the mom and dad defend them for 10 months actually. So these are their eggs right here, and they defend them from these gigantic, disgusting worms that will come and eat, basically chomp away and eat the eggs. So you can't really see it, but there are some really big teeth in here that help when they're trying to defend their nests from these worms. And then we use just basic aquarium nets and sort of these bags that we've outfitted. And you can't really tell, but this is a nod to the Canadianism. This is Justin Bieber duct tape down here. And we collect all these little baby fish and can bring them up to the surface. And then what can we do with these fish once we have them, right? So I told you we bring them back to the lab, we raise them under future ocean conditions, and we ask them, how are you doing from an energy perspective? So we can look at things like, this is not playing. Let me see if I can get it to play. Oh yeah, it is. Okay, so we can look at things like measuring breathing rate, right? So how much energy are they bringing in? We can look at heart rate, right? So how much, what's the delivery of oxygen to the rest of the body? And so all I've done is just change the imaging so that I can have students measure heart rate, but also stroke volume, right? How much do they pump every beat by measuring the difference in the big red circle versus the little red circle, right? It's the science that we do down there is really very basic, but can really shed a lot of light on how an animal is faring. We can euthanize, or we can kill an animal and preserve it. And then back at UC Davis, we can dye the animal's cartilage and bone 2 different colors. And we can then look at the fine structure of bone development and ask, is energy being diverted away from growth if they're being raised under these warm, acidic ocean conditions? And we can do a very similar thing when we look at growth in embryos, right? So this is a fish egg, right? When they're really, really young, it's just a mass of cells right here. So that's gonna turn into a fish, and it's being fed by this big yolk sac, kind of like the same as you would have in a chicken egg. And eventually over time, you're gonna start to see this baby fish form. And if I were to take it out of the chorion, you can see its eye. It's very cool. You can see its heart beating. This is its heart right here. And we can see all kinds of structures like bones developing, muscles developing, and we can look at development. So what I can tell you is that Antarctic fishes are not great at multitasking. They can cope with elevated CO2, right? So they can cope with ocean acidification or elevated temperature alone. So if you just give them one of those stressors, they're able to balance energy supply and demand. But if you give them both together, they're not able to cope. And that's where we're worried, because we know that as oceans are warming, they're also becoming more acidic. So it's not like the fish can say, hey, you know, just give me one of those stressors and I'll take the other one later. They're going to come together. And what we've seen so far tells us that Antarctic fishes are going to be very sensitive under climate change. Fish eggs and recently hatched fish, so we call these larvae, they're more sensitive to stress than fish that are 1 to 2 years old, and they're also more sensitive than adults. And what we're seeing is that it's really coming down to their inability to balance energy supply and demand. That's the root of the problem. So that kind of is going to wrap up my talk today, but I wanted to sort of bring you back to this. So this is where I was when I started as a camper at GBC with great hair. And here I am now leading my own research team down in the Antarctic. A lot has changed, but two things haven't. I still love pizza that has pineapple on it. But probably more importantly, I'm still fascinated with the natural world and the weird and wonderful critters that sort of live in diverse habitats, not only in my backyard. I do a lot of work along our California coast, but also across the globe. And what's changed now is that I really want to be part of the solution for helping preserve our natural landscapes to ensure that they're there for my niece and nephews and for the, for all the next generations. And when I talk to students in classrooms, they ask what they can do, because adults, are the ones that make the decisions. And so I have a lot of adults in the room, and I think I have some students in the room. And so I want to speak to the students and tell them that there is actually a lot you can do, because as adults, we want to leave you a planet that's better than what we have today. So your job is to talk to the adults in your life, your parents, your guardians, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, your neighbors, and tell them what's important to you. Tell them what you're learning in school in terms of the effects that we're having in the natural world, because adults are listening. And I really think that students are the next champions of our planet. I live in the US, so I don't live in a bubble. Voting is very important, and you can see how, how polarized a country can be in terms of whether or not they believe in climate change. And so, we're all hoping for a brighter future here in the US. And I guess I'll just end with, for the students, if you have an interest in science, again, I just want to tell you there's a lot of room at our table for you to join us. And so feel free to reach out to me if you want to get an idea of how I got where I am and all the different sort of steps along the way. Some of you will have people that can help you, and some of you won't. And so I'm here to help if there's someone else in your life that can't answer these questions for you. So thank you.
To do is continue to thrive and adapt to all these new challenges that surely are coming our way.